Without doubt, one of the biggest stories of the 2023 Formula One season is the sheer pace of the Aston Martin. Nobody outside of the Silverstone-based team really expected the Green Machines to be quite so competitive from the outset of the season. Going into the Canadian Grand Prix, they've ratcheted things up more than a little notch. The team have been giving some real fighting talk, saying they're going to crush Mercedes at the Canadian Grand Prix. And Fernando Alonso is expected to be one of two cars from the team expected to be on the podium. Really big fighting talk there from the team owner, Lawrence Stroll, a Canadian himself. To achieve those ends, Aston Martin has bought a massive upgrade package to the Montreal circuit. And unsurprisingly, some of the most talked about features of the Aston Martin AMR 23 are parts that have been changed for this race. And I'll start off by talking about the side pod design. Now, you may have talked about this and heard about this all season long, these deep dish sections on the side of the Aston Martin. We've talked about it loads on Tech Talk already this year, those big valleys down the side of the side pods. Well, those parts were very heavily inspired by the Ferrari from last season, and they had this very distinctive scalloped out shape along the side of the car, something that they sort of rationalised earlier into this season in a slightly tamer version for the 2023 Formula One season. Well, Ferrari's inspiration has been taken on by Aston Martin to a much deeper degree. Those scallops are much deeper on the green car. However, that is something other teams have taken inspiration from as well. The Alpine here, we've talked about this before as well, they too have adopted this very deep scalloping along the side pod of the car, and it's something other teams like Mercedes and some of the others, Williams as well, have been taking a wee look at through the season. I think we'll see more teams taking this route. Well, coming into the Canadian Grand Prix, there was a little bit of a surprise then, because Aston Martin have changed this part of the car. This section at the leading edge of this scalloping, so you can see that shape, it's still there and the deep valleys are still there, but the entry to this scalloping is much tighter than it had been previously. So you can see that section there. Well, if you take a look at the previous version of the car seen top down here in Spain, you can see that entry to this channel is much wider on the previous version of the car. But on the new version, look, it's much tighter, it's the same depth, it's not as deep, but they're changing the airflow around the rear of the car, and that's had a knock-on effect on various other parts of the bodywork. So you still have these very deep valleys, but you now have a slightly raised centre section of the bodywork. They've completely reshaped that part of the car. Now, when teams bring big upgrades to the car for any single Grand Prix, they have to advise the FIA in advance of what they've changed, and then a document's produced that's shared with all of the media listing all of the upgrades. Well, Aston Martin's been a little bit cheeky perhaps, because they listed the upgrades and they sort of said, we've got a new engine cover, but didn't go into great detail talking about how much of the side pod shape has really changed on this car, because I think it goes a lot further than the side pod shape, the engine cover itself. Now, here's another view of that side pod entry. You can see this is the section that's been heavily modified, and this section here, this big flat topped section, is much wider. Now, in case you're wondering what's in this long section along here, well, at the front of it there are some radiator ducts, some air coolers. They're not really in the back of it. This rear section of the bodywork is pretty much empty. That's something that's common up and down the grid. The back ends of these bodywork are empty, and then you've got this bulge here which houses the outer edge of the power unit. That's why there's a bit of a shape there. You've got to put the exhaust stack somewhere. So that's what Aston Martin have done there. But what I really wanted to draw your attention to actually is the shape on the base of the side pod. That's something that's really dramatically different. Aston Martin's done a huge amount of work here. They've introduced a completely new floor as well, but as we saw in Monaco, all the really exciting bits of the floor you can't see with the car on the ground. A driver has to induce a crane intervention to let us see what's going on underneath it, and I don't think either driver wants to do that at the Canadian Grand Prix, because Lawrence Stroll, I guess he wouldn't be particularly happy about a broken Aston Martin at his home Grand Prix. But let's start with the front leading edge of the floor. This section around here, where it says Juniper and Aston Martin, this has been completely reshaped, slightly more inwards, slightly more sculpted. team trying to get the airflow doing what they want around this area. Lots of people will tell you, pretending to be experts, saying they know exactly what that's doing. Well, if they haven't looked at the CFD data or the wind tunnel data, they don't have a clue. Something the team have got is this nice little stepped detail at the rear of this sticky forwards bit, I guess we call it. Some people call them forward floor wings. I prefer sticky forwards bit. And you can see this little stepped section and then almost a little slide section towards the rear. Again, playing around with the aerodynamics, working out what's going on there. Takes quite a lot of powerful computers and a rather good wind tunnel. Aston Martin, of course, building their own new wind tunnel at their Silverstone factory. It's not ready yet, so this stuff's all been developed in the Mercedes wind tunnel, which they share with the Works team. Now, look along this section of the side pod. You can see how it almost sticks forward slightly. Almost looks to my eye like that would induce a bit of drag, but as I say, you can't really tell from looking at a shape what it will do at 300 kph. The way air flows around is kind of a funny thing. Lots of complex chaos theory sort of stuff going into the software that makes it. But the undercut on the side pod, this section here, far, far deeper, almost like a twin floor, some people would have called it. If you looked at an old Alfa Tauri or Toro Rosso design from a few years ago, they called that sort of style a twin floor. Not really a twin floor in the 1992 Ferrari sense, but something along those lines. The other part of the car has been completely reshaped is the rear end of that side pod. It's not just the entry to the valleys, it's the whole shape. A little bit less curved above the sea of Cognizant. And I wonder if any of that Cognizant AI has been used to develop some of the floors. I've been told some rumours that it has been. Another section to look at as well, there's so much on this car, it's really fun, is this section up here. This upper deck of the bodywork used to scoop down towards the rear above that number 18 a lot earlier, a lot further forward towards this Crypto.com logo. And that's where they've moved that slightly rearward, raised this section. Again, there's nothing housed under this lump. It's just for aerodynamic purposes, empty. Some cooling outlets, some cooling flows. And that's something else they've changed is these cooling louvres. They're pretty much the same concept they've had for a while, just a different shape from the Canadian Grand Prix onwards. But look, a lot of this is all going to look very familiar to you if you're a regular viewer of Tech Talk, because look, let's take this view of the Aston Martin. We looked at it and talked about it a little bit already. You can see that deep scalloping, that very distinctive shape. Well, have a look at this. This is the upgraded Ferrari that we saw in the Spanish Grand Prix. And there it is again, that deep scalloping, that raised centre section of the bodywork, that very distinct section, and then that ramp down. Now, some people ridiculously called this a Red Bull copy. It's nothing to do with Red Bull inspiration. This is Ferrari's own work. Well, Aston Martin have taken almost the same route with this, and I think that's really fascinating because there's clearly something to this design concept, and it's very different to what Red Bull are doing. So it's going to two very different diverging concepts again. So I think that's lovely to see in Formula One. It's one of the joys of Formula One as well, the different engineering concepts you're going to see. Well, those engineering concepts continue to the rear of the car. And actually, Aston Martin have been taking a little bit of inspiration from the Haas playbook, another Ferrari-powered car. Interesting, Aston Martin with Mercedes engine for now, switching to Honda for 2026. That's going to be interesting to see. We see this rear shape of the car, that sort of almost double-barreled shotgun style. There's another little exit you'll see. I'll show you another picture of that in a minute. But have a look at this. Around the number 18, you've got this sort of tail or this shark fin style design on the back of the engine cover. All cars have this by regulation. There's a lot of different shapes being played with. Well, for the Canadian Grand Prix, Aston Martin have completely redesigned that and introduced this very distinctive and very sharp shark fin. So sharp that I think actually when these engine covers are transported, they actually have to put a little bit of a snubber, a little bit of packaging so people don't prick their fingers on it as it's moved around the garage. So I think you'll see the teams doing that for transporting those parts. And you can really see that raised upper section of the bodywork there and that revised cooling louver layout. But have a look here, you've got an additional cooling slot at the back of the bodywork. And that's something Haas introduced with the VF22 last season when they had that enormous wind tunnel allowance. Well, they came up with a solution very similar to that and utilised that quite nicely. Here we go to take a look at how it was before. You can see just at the top of my screen here, you can see that almost, I don't know, double-barreled shotgun sort of shape or a big M shape, and you can see there's no cooling outlet at the top of that. it's just all closed in. So a little bit more cooling at the rear of the Aston Martin. Now, cooling is always a play-off against aerodynamic drag versus how much cooling flow you get under the bodywork of the car. And I wonder if they're playing around with that quite a lot. You can get another look of it just here. You can just see some of the components. That's the exhaust down there. And if you take a look, you can just see what I think is the transmission or ERS cooler underneath this section of the bodywork around there. So there's a few coolers to be fed by this car. Interesting design, massive step forward. So what are they trying to do? Well, the pithy answer is they're trying to make the car a bit faster. Well, it's already very fast, but they want to make it as quick as Max Verstappen's Red Bull. That's the target, beating Red Bull around any circuit. Well, because of the issues with Free Practice 1 in Canada, we can't really do a like-for-like comparison from free practice. But what we can do is take a look back at the Spanish Grand Prix and compare Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin and Max Verstappen's Red Bull. And it's really, really interesting to see the difference between these two very different cars. Max Verstappen's car, he's the blue line. Fernando Alonso, he's the yellow line. And you can see here that the Aston Martin is really good on acceleration and in medium speed corners like these ones around the lap. But the Red Bull has the advantage in the higher speed corners, in low speed corners, and a massive advantage down the straights. And that's something that you're going to see all year long. I think that's kind of baked into the car's design. But take a look in more detail. You can see the apex speeds in medium speed corners for Fernando Alonso significantly quicker than that of Max Verstappen. But the top speed of the Red Bull with that Honda power unit, can't really match it. And I don't think the Mercedes is going to be able to match that top speed and that power output of the Honda. Maybe that's one of the reasons that Aston Martin are switching to the Japanese power unit when Red Bull switched to Ford in 2026. And then you can see this section building up speed into the medium speed corners. Acceleration is one of the real strong suits of the Aston Martin. But looking at that, the Montreal circuit doesn't really lend itself to the Aston Martin, in my opinion. Lots of big stops and lots of straights. That should really favour the Red Bull. But the battle between Red Bull and Aston Martin is going to take a slightly different turn as we move into the second half of the year. June is a crucial date in Formula One aerodynamic development because we talk about the aerodynamic testing restrictions. Red Bull Racing has the smallest allowance of any team because of that cost cap penalty, but also because they won the Constructors' Championship last season. Aston Martin at the start of this season had double the aerodynamic allowance of Red Bull. But in June, that all changes. The teams have all of their allowances reset. Aston Martin, now third in the championship, are now reset based on that. So they lose a chunk of their allocation. Red Bull still remains the smallest, but Aston Martin doesn't have as much as it did. So this upgrade package is super important. But there's a crucial point to make about this. Aston Martin could still bring some really big upgrades on the run up to Silverstone, I suspect, because the aerodynamic work on some new parts has been done in the run up to about now, mid-June, but those upgrades haven't been manufactured yet. So it will take a while for the team to actually manufacture them and then bring them to the circuit and validate them. So there's a bit more work to do from Aston Martin. There's more upgrades to come, but then they're going to be more constrained in the development they can do to their car to take the fight to the Red Bulls. And I think that's going to be crucial for how the second half of this year and more than the second half of this season plays out. Because Aston Martin, if these upgrades work, they really could be taking to the fight to Red Bull, and they really could smash Mercedes.